Well, thank you for joining Peter and me. The Christmas New Year period has been characterised by a pile-on against the Prime Minister. The story's pretty simple. The left have not recovered from getting done over at the last election, and the bushfires, and then Bridget McKenzie. If you're interested, I wrote about that in today's Sydney's Daily Telegraph, by the way, on page 13. But they gave the left the excuse they needed to bash up Morrison. Most of the media fell into line, and the public, seeing the headlines and hearing this stuff ad nauseum, have responded via the news poll. Morrison's in trouble, they say. The coalition's behind Labor 52-48. I would imagine if Scott Morrison was 52-48 in the polls this time last year, he would have been very happy. Nonetheless, the left are into it with their propaganda. Everything's climate change. None of them can define what they mean by climate change. If it's carbon dioxide, then 0.04% of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. You'd have to be an intellectual cripple to believe that that was a problem. Nonetheless, drought is climate change, bushfires are climate change, the snow in Kabul is climate change, the floods in Britain, or forget Britain, the floods 2 weeks ago on the Gold Coast, that's climate change, an earthquake in Papua New Guinea, climate change, floods in India, climate change, the dog's broken loose from its chain, climate change. It suits the left. It's propaganda and it's untrue. But the trouble is this stuff is happening everywhere. The classrooms, primary school, secondary school, universities, they're full of it. Large chunks of the media, so children march in the streets crying because some 16-year-old girl tells them they should fear for their future. This is the new religion. It's everywhere. We have a choice. Do you fight against this brainwashing, or do you shrug your shoulders and let it go on? Recently, Generation Liberty, the Institute of Public Affairs program for people under 25, had its application for a stall at Queensland University of Technology's Orientation Week knocked back because the youth group's brand, they were conservatives, didn't align with the Queensland University of Technology student union's values. Generation Liberty is not affiliated with any political party, but it is committed to challenging what it describes as the radical story taught by universities. It seeks to promote free markets, individual responsibility, capitalism, democracy. The left hate them all. So Generation Liberty has been denied a stall at Orientation Week, but the left-wing outfit, Socialist Alternative, which describes itself as a Trotskyist organisation, has been allowed a stall. And as the Generation Liberty campus coordinator Chris Decker said, this is all about crushing dissent and difference of opinion. And this is where we are today. Argue against climate change, you're vilified with hate language. Argue in favour of capitalism in your university assignment, you'll most probably be failed. Argue against same-sex marriage, and you get the vilification that Margaret Court has had to endure. Well, Amanda Stoker is a Liberal Queensland Senator. She's got a few crosses to bear, actually. For a start, she's smart. An honours degree in law. She's been a judge's associate, a prosecutor at the Commonwealth DPP. She's also the mother of 3 young girls, happily married to Adam. And she was born in Liverpool in Western Sydney. She could be said to represent the young, fresh face of free speech and traditional values in a Liberal Party which often vacates the field on both those issues. She says she came into Parliament because she was frustrated. She said, I wanted to see us become a party that was confident and unashamed of our values. And ultimately, I'm a doer, so I put my hand up. Neither of her parents finished high school. Her dad's a plumber. She worked 4 jobs to get through university. Why wouldn't she be the standard bearer for women breaking through the glass ceiling? Simple answer, she's not from the left. And she's had a bit to say about this nonsense at the Queensland University of Technology's Orientation Week, and she joins us from Canberra. Amanda, lovely to have you. Lovely to have you on the program. You're a great story.
Hi, Alan. Hi, Peter.
You're a great story. Dad's a plumber.
Thanks very much. It's just a regular Australian story. Most Australians are like me. There's nothing extraordinary about it, and that's exactly how democracy should be.
But neither of your parents finished high school?
Yeah. Campbelltown High kids?
Campbelltown High kids. You say the Liberal Party has lost the argument in defence of things like free speech and traditional values.
Well, when you don't bother to show up and argue some of these more difficult things, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about identity politics, whether we're talking about some of the big social changes we've seen over the last couple of decades, if you don't show up and make the hard, sometimes uncomfortable arguments, then you lose by default. So when we look at the way people get so hysterical about climate change, that's a product of a failure of some people over the last 20 years not to be willing to engage on this issue. And that's meant that many of our educational institutions, like our schools and universities, are just producing more and more young people who have a whipped up, hysterical, emotional response of crisis to this, instead of understanding that there's a whole lot of different intellectual perspectives. Not all of them are created equal, and that people can disagree without being evil or trying to kill one another.
But so explain to me why this is, Amanda, because the Liberal Party has fronted up in the past to really tough fights, intellectual arguments on something like turning the boats around. We're a really generous nation, but we weren't going to be told by people smugglers and the UN who will come to Australia. That was a really unpopular argument in the Howard years, and we revisited it again in 2013. Every single election we've had where the issue has been one primarily of climate change, the Australian voters have backed back in the centre-right. But why is it that the party room goes weak on this issue? Why, when they're in government without a Tony Abbott out there or others to really push the barrow, are the principals in the ministries in Canberra scared of the word climate change? Why are the moderates holding sway in the party room on this issue? Because I think the community are up for a sober and cogent debate.
Correct.
I think we're at the point right now where we've got something of a compromise position. There's a degree of emissions reduction that meets the Paris target, that satisfies those who are from an urban and quite white-collar base that tends to get whipped up about these things, and that doesn't completely destroy the job opportunities of people in places like where I'm from, in Queensland, where people desperately need, for instance, the 1 in 7 jobs that come from the mining industry, or even more jobs coming from transport and agriculture. You know, so it's a compromise.
They've lost one of their best advocates today, Matt Canavan, and I mean, this is the lucky dip that is with portfolios. God help us who gets that portfolio. If they've got some metal, they might continue to argue for jobs and reality like Matt did, but it could go to a lefty inside the National Party, and yes, they do have them. And then we're back to square one, where we're basically in a defence position,
not an offensive. The left are cheering.
Not an offensive position.
The left are cheering. They've got rid of Matt Canavan. They can go on demonising coal again now. Could I just come back to the thing that you, though, have talked about, and you did in your maiden speech, this question of values and the kind of values that we try to inculcate into our young people. You talked about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes. Can you amplify that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of the major differences between the right and the left in this country. The left will tell you we have to guarantee equality of outcomes for all people. Now, that's an empty promise because you can never deliver it. But even if you could, it'd be pretty horrible, because every individual has their own version of what makes a great life. And so the best thing we can do as a government and as a free society is give every single individual the opportunity to do their very best, and a level playing field from which they can chase their own version of the perfect life. And whether that means being an artist in the country, whether that means being a CEO in the city, whether that means being a farmer on the fringes, whatever. But that's a choice for the individual. When we try and ask governments to do those things, they always get it wrong, and it ends up a totalitarian mess.
You're amazing. You're amazing. Now, taking Peter's point up and abandoning, and yours as well, vacating the field, freedom of speech.
Yeah, I feel really strongly about this, and the example from QUT this week shows that this is a fight we still really need to have. The idea that QUT's administration, and it wasn't the student guild, it's usually blamed on, student politics, these sorts of decisions. It was a university decision to allow the socialist alternative, you could call them communists because that is what they believe, who have year after year, without being an affiliated club, had a stall at Orientation Week, no problems, to then knock back Generation Liberty, who are sensible mainstream people who just want to counter that narrative with some sensible stuff, like individual responsibility, like the value of free markets, like the value of capitalism. This is not outlandish sets of ideas. They get knocked back. Socialist Alliance get the big old tick. If that's okay in a university that says it is preparing students to take on the world, Well, they're not going to be able to do it unless they're exposed to this idea called political balance and intellectual rigour and freedom of speech. They're not prepared for the real world unless they know how to engage with different sets of ideas and sort them out for themselves according to the evidence. But when we only expose them to one view of the world at university, we're setting them up to fail. And that's cheating Australian students of the opportunity they should be getting from their education.
Look, I 100% agree with you. I'm listening to you and thinking this woman has got to be in the cabinet.
Absolutely.
Where is Scott Morrison tonight? Then I'm thinking, Alan, honestly, and you won't like this, Amanda, but I'm thinking don't put her in the cabinet yet, because without her arguing values, and that's the absolute marrow of every political party, without Amanda arguing values, who else talks about values? Since my old boss left, he was someone who was comfortable having that unpopular values discussion. But look at the curriculum. Gone are the days where you have facts on both sides of the argument and kids form a view that has some understanding of what's at stake. Universities, I don't know about you, I'm older than you, I think, Amanda, but it was a contest of ideas that'd almost be this sort of battery, you know, belting up in an ideas sense. Encouraged.
Challenge,
and you learn. I learned an enormous amount by getting inside the mind of your opponent, going to classes. I did feminist legal theory, not because I was bad about the subject, but if I wanted to argue my corner, I had to understand how the enemy thought.
That's it.
Not anymore.
No.
We shut down alternative views. Now, Dan Tehan's in the federal parliament. He's the education minister. Most of the money in our tertiary institutions comes from your budget. What can we do about it?
Well, there's a couple of things we can do to deal with the problems you've raised. The first is something I'm really excited about, and that is after lots of lobbying from people like me to our Minister for Education, Dan Tehan, the Morrison government has committed to a full review of the school curriculum to declutter it from all of the nonsense and the political garbage that's been shoved in there over recent years and focus on the basics. Because if we can nail down the basics in our schools, we'll perform well in the school rankings against the OECD.
But just to interrupt you there, Amanda,
to
interrupt you there, we don't have the teachers. The teachers have been cultivated in the corrupt system that you're talking about. We don't have the teachers to do the job.
Quite right. It's going to take some time, but that's a good start. It's a good start. Then when we get to our universities, we've got to do an awful lot more. Now, we have a regulator for our universities called TEQSA, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Authority. And I suspect they're growing to not like me very much because I'm becoming a real pain. But they are a complaints-driven organisation. And when I have students come to me every day of the week and say, I don't express my point of view because when I do, I get failed.
Correct.
I can't speak up in class because when I do, I'm accused of discrimination, even when I'm polite about people with different points of view. When students are coming to me with those sort of stories all the time, we need to inundate TEQSA with those kinds of real-life stories for investigation so they start to understand the magnitude of the problem that our universities face. Because if we don't get that right, as you've identified, Alan, we don't get teachers who've got their heads screwed on straight. We don't get academics for the future who understand the value of balance. And if we don't protect intellectual freedom and we don't protect free speech, we're not far away from not having free thought. Lose that, and you pretty much lose the strength of any civilisation.
Just a quick one before we go, Amanda. Freedom of religion, that's back on the table for the government when Parliament returns, which it has this week. One of the worries is it'll be used by cultish-type bodies as a sword against more conservative religions rather than protecting what we have. It'll actually put it at risk. Where's this going to land?
Well, I think we better get Amanda back because we're out of time. I mean, what I wanted to say
I'll get back to you.
What I wanted to say is that the lady you're seeing on your screen tonight in the Senate in 2018 moved a motion which called late-term abortion a crime, and she was branded a proponent of hate speech. That's how low and we've sunk. You better come back. You're an absolute star. We've loved having you on the program. Thank you for everything, but above all else, thank you for what's between the ears. Hey, she's got it, hasn't she?
Oh, yeah.
Amazing. Good stuff. Amanda Stoker, a Queenslander. Senator Amanda Stoker.